right, well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dave Deptula, AFA's Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, and welcome to our Aerospace Nation speaker series. We're very pleased that General Sevy Wilson could join us today. General Wilson is the Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, where he presides over the Air Staff and serves as a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Requirements Oversight Council and the Deputy Advisory Working Group. So welcome, Sevy, and thanks very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. I'd like to start off by giving you the opportunity to set the stage, make some opening remarks, and I'd be particularly interested in the top challenges that you think will prove crucial for the Air Force as we face an ever-increasing set of security challenges. So with that, over to you.
Yeah. So Dave, thanks for hosting this. Thanks for the Mitchell Institute, all that you do to keep this dialogue moving along. Because I think it's a really important discussion that we have, not only for our Air Force, but for our nation. You know, I would argue today we're living in unprecedented times, and COVID-19 has just exacerbated all of that. So that as I look around, I keep coming back to a story that I keep telling that says, the challenges I think the American public is waking up to are not just national defense. It's not just a whole government effort that we need going forward. I think it's a whole of nation effort we need moving forward as America to be able to compete and deter in this new world we find ourselves in. And I think this, again, the COVID situation has highlighted that to the American public about this competition is having globally, and it's going to take all of us, all Americans coming together to be able to deter and then compete in this global world that we live in. So Dave, let me just stop, because I know we're starting a few minutes late. Let me just stop there. I know we've got lots of questions out there, and I saw we have a pretty big list of folks from across industry and the media and civic leaders on board, so we'll get right to the questions.
All right, well, very good. Thanks, first off, thanks very much for all that you do, General Wilson and your team, to juggle so many challenging issues in such a challenging era. One has to think all the way back to the Cold War to find parallels. And even then, complicating factors like cyberspace. It's kind of amazing that for those of us who are old enough to remember what was going on back then, cyberspace wasn't part of the equation back then. So your job's even harder today. Now, to start off, I'd like to begin with a pragmatic real-world demand for aerospace capabilities and associated resources. In light of the COVID-19 spending, many are now advocating steep cuts to future Defense Department budgets. And the Air Force finds itself caught in this era of flying the smallest and oldest aircraft force in its history, with necessary modernization having been deferred for 3 decades now. So how would you explain the Air Force's need for resources at this critical juncture to those who are now advocating cuts?
Yeah, Dave, I'd say, first of all, what the Air Force brings unique capabilities to the nation. And to me, it's the wrong time to be making defense cuts, because I want to be able to deter any type of great power conflict. And we've seen that when we come out of that space, we lack the capability or the capacity that others will move into that space. And so today, look at the things that the United States Air Force does that nobody else does. Right. So let's just take nuclear deterrence. Right. We always talk about a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent, and your Air Force owns 2 of the 3 legs of the nuclear triad and 75% of the NC3 that supports that. When you look at defending the homeland, look at all the air defense units surrounding the United States that do just that, defend the homeland. Right. But besides that, you look at what the Department of the Air Force does. We own the high ground of air and space. Right. We're being able to surveil the planet. We're delivering airlift globally across the world today. We have lots of unique things that your United States Air Force does. And as you highlighted today, the force is old and the force is too small. And so we would argue that this is not a time to be advocating for defense cuts, that we need to stay the course. We have a good plan to build the Air Force we need, and we need to continue on that plan to do just that.
And I also, if I may, just throw in there that those that are calling for cuts are calling for those cuts absent the incorporation of what the demands of the national security strategy are. So, if we're going to meet the demands of the national security strategy, we need to resource it to be able to do that. Or the other choice is you change and lower the demands of the national security strategy. Building off that first question, in 2018, you were part of the leadership team that issued the call for the Air Force we need, speaking of national security strategy, specifically the Air Force we need to meet the demands of the national security strategy, with a focus on 386 operational squadrons. Some are now dismissing that goal as overtaken by events given COVID-19 relief spending. However, I'd like to point out that the threats to the nation have not diminished. And in many ways, as you just mentioned, this crisis has added increasingly complex factors. So could you comment on the importance of 386 as a measure of helping leaders understand the Air Force the nation really needs, vice one dictated by arbitrary budget limits?
Yeah, Dave, we've talked about that before. The way you and I used to know this in the old days was the difference between the planning force and the programming force, right? And the difference between those two is risk. And as you've highlighted, we looked at the National Defense Strategy. We used that as our signpost. We ran lots of war games against peer competitors and looked at the force that we need to be able to do what the National Security Strategy says. And that number came out to 386. Today, we're smaller than that. Right, and so that's the risk that we buy, but that hasn't changed the facts, right? And so we would say that number is still the goal we ought to be shooting for our Air Force, and then getting the right mix of the right different squadrons. Let's go back to where you also in the 1990s we didn't have cyber force. Today we do. Space played a much less prominent role in what we do across military operations than it does today. And so getting the right number of squadrons, identifying the pacing squadrons, making sure they're ready to be able to do what our nation demands is what we're trying to do and to build that force we need. So we haven't backed away from 386. We think we're going to continue to look at that and what the mix is in that. But as you and I, again, let's go back to our early days. As we went into Desert Storm against what General Golding would call a middleweight, we had 412 operational squadrons. Today, we have much less than that. Right? We also see the world has changed, and we also have this rise of these peer competitors. And so we think that number still holds true in 386.
Now, this year, the Air Force asked Congress to consider a number of aircraft retirements in your budget submission. This surprised some individuals, given the need that you just talked about to grow Air Force capacity. And there are those out there that understand your aim of freeing up resources to invest in new aircraft and technologies related to joint all-domain command and control. However, numbers matter. How do you determine when an already small force gets too small?
David, it's as we look at the force structure, we're always balancing this, capability, capacity, and readiness equation. As we try and build the force we need, we also have to look at what are those things that aren't going to be, that only work in an uncontested environment, that are single mission platforms. We have to be able to take those resources to be able to invest in the force we need, and that's why we made the decisions we made this year. You also look back in our time early on in our careers where if we deployed 90 days or 120 days a year, every 3 years, that would be a big deal. Today, it's not uncommon to find captains that have been in less than 8 or 9 years that are on their six-month rotation. And then when they come home from their deployment, right, then they're preparing to, all the doing exercises to be able to be ready for a peer competitor. And so they're finding themselves coming and going with a very high purse tempo and a very high ops tempo. And so we're trying to get that right. So we either have to reduce our demands or we're going to be stretching this force that's already stretched thin. And we think, again, we've said that the first way to improve our readiness is to increase our number of airmen in our Air Force. And that's why continue to push ahead to drive for an increased number of folks coming into the force.
Sevi, a lot's changed from the days when you and I were flying operationally in what airmen are currently achieving when they take to the sky. In looking at what you've observed during your tenure as the vice chief, what are the top technologies that are changing the game and might increase aerospace power's potential in the future? And how's the Air Force capitalizing on these?
Yeah, so we're working really closely with OST, with Dr. Griffin and Dr. Mark Lewis, who used to be the Air Force chief scientist. They've identified 11 areas that they're focused on, that they actually have an assistant working for identified person working for Dr. Griffin in each of these areas. But there are areas like fully networked C3, and we're going to call that's where our JET C2 competition comes in there. Hypersonics, cyber, directed energy, autonomy, AI, quantum, space, 5G, biotechnology are, I think, the 11 big areas that they're focused on, and certainly we are also. And so between our R&D and each of those efforts, and some are bigger than others, but we think a lot of those have specific direct applications to the Department of the Air Force. Certainly fully networked C3 and all our efforts, I can talk about that later on what we're doing with what we're calling joint all-domain C2. Certainly our efforts in hypersonics, and we've got a lot of efforts going there that Dr. Roper and his team are leading, whether it be the Aero program and others, between direct energy, between cyber, space, AI. I could spend a lot of time talking about the investment we're making with our AI accelerator with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and our work partnering with them. They've got a bunch of experts. We've got a bunch of hard problems. How can I meet those together to help us in areas like AI, in areas like autonomy? Certainly, all the things going on in space and what General Raymond and team are doing there to help build the Space Force and make sure that we can dominate the high ground of space. We also think that another key aspect of those is not that any individual one of those, but the convergence of all of those together will be another leap forward and game changer that I can't even predict what will happen in the next 10 years when I can converge autonomy with AI, with hypersonics, with fully networked command and control, with cyber, and my mind explodes with the potentials of what that could be for us in the United States Air Force.
I think, if I may, that is an excellent point in that these are really leap ahead technologies. And when you combine them with the glue that is all domain command and control, the potential is pretty incredible. And I saw just yesterday the announcement that the Air Force gave a production go-ahead on the advanced hypersonic air-launched missile. And so a lot of the things that you mentioned are well beyond PowerPoint, where they're actually becoming a reality. So congratulations on that fast movement. As General Goldfein recently mentioned, the Air Force is currently enjoying something it really hasn't had the benefit of for many years, and that's a number of active production lines. Could you explain how this is impacting your thinking when it comes to investment, sustainment, and modernization? And how do you work a bridging strategy when a badly needed aircraft like the B-21 won't be available for several years, and yet we need to reset that mission area right now?
Yeah, so again, this goes into that kind of all-of-nation response, and how do we continue to help with the industrial base and look for opportunities there. We do have lots of production capabilities that are starting and we think can accelerate. We think we can take advantage of that once we get production lines up and running. How do we even increase capacity through that? Again, that'll take working with Congress. What we've experienced, in the old past, right, is we stopped producing airplanes, right? There was one point a few years back where we were making a small number of airplanes per year. We want to get into producing lots of airplanes and producing them at scale and quantity. heard Dr. Roper talk about Century Series and how do I have production lines open, that I'm constantly producing capability in the aerospace world for our nation and certainly for us as the Air Force. Then how do we leverage that at scale and buy more versus in the past, limited to a budget, got delayed, so I needed 100 of whatever it was, rather than buy 50 a year for 2 years, we buy 10 a year for 10 years, right? And so we've got to figure out a way to accelerate that and have continued hot production lines. We also think we have to balance, how do I take the current capability, and you mentioned the B-21, which will come on in a few years, and then modernize the capability that I need, for example, with the B-52. So what are the things that I can do working with industry to make the B-52 that much more viable, that much faster, whether it be re-engineering or the new avionics that we're going to put on it, mating it with the weapons, and then I've got both of those working in parallel to be able to move forward. And again, for part of this, let's take one of the decisions we made this last year on the B-1, right? I'm a B-1 guy. I love the B-1. Amazing airplane. What we did is we took the older ones that had the most structural problems, to be able to divest those to make the ones we have the most viable that they can possibly be going forward. And so that's the kind of how we're trying to balance both the capacity now as well as capacity in the future. And again, we think that there's a long-range strike, what our long-range bomber capability provides our nation is one of those things unique to our Air Force that we need to continue to invest heavily in.
We had the pleasure of hosting Preston Dunlop last week on this series, and he provided a great update regarding the Advanced Battle Management System and Joint All-Domain Command and Control. Could you provide us some insight from your vantage regarding how these concepts are progressing in the Air Force and related actions that you're seeing across DoD? If you were to advise your successor on top priorities that have to be guarded to realize these visions, what would they be?
Yeah, certainly JADC2 is really critically important, not just for the Air Force, but for the department. And so we're Preston and General Kumashiro and the team there are working really hard. And I know he's outlined the capabilities in terms of how do I get the right software to the cloud, to the network, and connect the force. And so that's really what the Air Force contribution is to JADC2. It's how do I connect the force? How do I build this Internet of Things that allows every platform to connect with every other platform? Again, that's how we're gonna win in future conflict. So the on-ramp demo that we did a few months back was highly successful. You know, we joked to the team that, hey, you did so well, you got 26 of 28 objectives met. We need to make it harder next time because we want to see you fail more. But in that demo, we connected Army systems on the ground to Navy ships, to 4th and 5th gen platforms that communicated amongst all of them. Oh, and by the way, to a commercial Starlink satellite from SpaceX, right? That's what we're talking about. So our contribution to that is ABS to the JADC2 effort. You know, the Navy's going to bring their NIFCA and their network cooperative engagement capability. The Army's going to be IBCS. So this isn't about taking people's stuff. It's about connecting the systems. As I told my Army Navy counterparts, for example, an F-35 is a flying supercomputer, right? And a sensor. It's got amazing capability. It will be able to share all kinds of information all the way down to the company and unit level in the Army. But just as importantly, I need the Army's information to be shared back up to the F-35 and conversely with the Navy systems and the space systems. And that's what we're trying to do on JADC2 is connect the force and this combat Internet of Things capability. So I think it's going well. We're having another on-ramp experiment the last couple of days of August, first week in September. We had to delay the June event because of COVID, but it's on track for late August, early September. We're excited to see that capability. We've got a bunch of the combatant commands with General Shaughnessy and what he's done with NORAD Northcom, as well as PACOM and STRATCOM participating. So I think it'll be a fantastic exercise. Speaking of which, let me just give you another example. So General Shaughnessy had the SecDef visiting recently, and he showed him how he's doing, in essence, what I just described for COVID, right? And he's being able to connect the force and see real time where doctors are, where supplies are, what the hot spots are, real time, not just from his office, but anybody who has that capability can see that. And I know the Secretary of Defense came away very impressed with the work that General O'Shaughnessy and his team were doing. And again, we're working hand in hand with them as we bring on JADC2 and make it reality. The hard part for everybody, though, it's not a thing. It's not, JADC2 is not a platform, right? It's lots of things. And again, and it's software and cloud and network and devices. And how do I build all that connects and can share information? And that's what we're trying to do.
Well, I think that, it's great to see that, after 20 years of hammering on the importance of realizing that aircraft like the F-22 and the F-35 aren't just Fs, but they're actually flying sensor effector shooters that are valued for their ability to collect information in contested airspace, then share it with the rest of the force. That some of the naysayers are finally coming around and realizing what's going on. And that example that you described that General O'Shaughnessy showed, I think is probably one of the best ways to get people to understand the value of the ubiquitous and seamless sharing of information. Let's move on to an area that you're really expert in, and that's nuclear deterrence. Our nuclear deterrent enterprise is clearly undergoing a level of modernization unprecedented in the modern era. Can you describe the underlying rationale for each element of the Air Force portions of this endeavor?
Yeah, well, Dave, is the whole audience knows that our nuclear deterrent is the foundation of our whole national defense. It's the bedrock from which we would do everything else. It's the #1 priority, and it's long past time to recapitalize those efforts. When you look at, each leg, let's take the bomber leg, right? Visible and flexible. You look at the ICBM leg, it's responsive and survivable. I would say the same thing for the Navy legs. All three legs of the triad complement each other. They all use, we talk about terms about survivable, responsive, flexible. They all have attributes of those lines, but in different ways. Our contributions involve certainly the bombers and ICBMs, as well as the NC3 that supports that. And again, just like JADC2, that's the glue that's going to tie it all together. In each one of those areas, we got major modernization efforts underway. Right, we bringing on the B-21, and I was out to see the team, and within the last few months, I'm on about a 6-month battle rhythm to go talk to them. They're making great progress. Jason Bartholomew's our GBSD program director out at Hill Air Force Base. He's doing fantastic work with GBSD and the team there. I think that's moving along very, very well. And again, all of us focused within the Air Force, but I'm going to say within the Department of Defense on NC3. It's helpful that General Hyten came from being the STRATCOM commander now to be the vice chairman. He's keenly focused on that. And so between National Nuclear Weapons Council and the other things that happen here in the building, the department is going to make sure that the nuclear enterprise continues full speed ahead. It's a priority for the department, because without it, right, it underwrites our whole national security strategy. And we talk about a safe, secure, and effective nuclear force, and we need to make sure we have those 3 words: safe, secure, and effective moving forward.
Recent opinion pieces by some in the arms control community have called for nuclear modernization to be canceled or severely curtailed, again, using COVID-19 as an excuse. Could you approach this issue from the other end of the equation and speak to us about the cost of not modernizing the triad?
Yeah, even, what I would say is at the peak of the nuclear recapitalization, it's going to be under 7% of the defense budget. I call this the nuclear modernization. What it does for the nation, it's the national insurance policy. Right? And it is absolutely affordable. Right? The nation can afford survival. So we need to make sure we modernize the force. We have our ICBMs, our Minuteman IIIs, which actually have some Minuteman I components on them, date back to the 60s. Right? Our Outcome, our air-launched cruise missiles, designed in the 70s, built in the 80s, are nearly 30 years past the design life of the missile. We have to modernize these capabilities. We just recently got out of the 8-inch floppy disk business, right? So I would say that so the things we need to do for our nation, vitally important. There will be those that says, well, we can save money, and I contend that I have to build this capability, right? Minuteman IIIs, we've done study after study after study. It doesn't, it costs you more to keep old capability than it is to bring on new capability. And oh, by the way, the older capability isn't going to meet those criteria in the future that being safe, secure, and reliable unless we modernize it. So we're going to, Dave, I'll tell you a story that I tell people. I've told it in lots of occasions. If you go down to New Orleans, Louisiana, you can go to a fantastic World War II museum. And on the museum, they talk about, you get a sensory theater perspective of what happened in World War II. And they talk about the 68 million people who died in World War II. All right, and the 100 million injured in World War II. And all of that happened before nuclear weapons. Right, and so when you look back at that part in the world's history, between the start of the World War, which I'm going to call 1940, and when it finished in 1945, about 60 months, that the world was killing each other at the tune of 1.1 million people per month, killed, with more than that injured. And I said, and all that was before nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapons, as Larry D. Welch would talk about, one of our former CSAFs, have been this instrument of world peace. It has stopped major conflict between great powers. It's important as a nation that we continue to have ours. I can tell you that the two other nations, Russia and China, have gone to great lengths to modernize and upgrade their nuclear force. It's time for the United States to continue to do ours.
Let's switch gears a bit. While this is in the news all the time, it seems, COVID-19, there's a particular aspect that I think the Air Force in its humility has sort of downplayed. And while certain members of the Air Force have been affected by the virus, it's not like we had to stand down an entire bomber or fighter wing, much like we've seen when an entire aircraft carrier has been incapacitated due to high infection rates. Could you speak to us about how the Air Force has worked to minimize the impact of COVID-19 and the lessons learned that may be useful when confronting future challenges like this?
Yeah, Dave, here's a secret sauce for our response to COVID-19. It's fantastic, empowered commanders and amazing airmen out in the field. Every little location is going to be different. You know, it's going to be different at Aviano than it is in Colorado. It's going to be different in Korea. We're all talking a lot. I have a weekly video teleconference with all the MAGCOM commanders specifically on COVID. I think the department's response writ large has been very good. We raised our health protection conditions to Charlie quickly. We've had the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Air Force very much on message saying, you know, this is first about taking care of our people. Second, it's about taking care of the national security missions that we perform for our nation. And the third piece, being able to respond and provide help to the American public. And that's, I think, what we've been doing as a Department of Defense. You know, our airmen, as you go, I've been to a couple places since the COVID outbreak. I've been to Kirtland, I've been to Beale, I'll go to Whiteman later this week to see what the commanders on the field are doing, but they know best the conditions. They're working between the mayors, between the governors, between their local community leaders, and I think setting a great example for what we should be doing in this world that we live in COVID. And let me give you a couple examples. I think that the world has changed in fundamental ways. Large public gatherings, going to very crowded bars or restaurants are a thing of the past, right? That isn't going to happen in this world, right? The new normal is such that I'm going to have 2 meter separation, 6 feet between people. If I get inside that, I've got a mask at the ready. That we've got testing conditions underway to allow people to do surveillance testing if need be. And we're working with the medical community, whether it be on plasmas or therapeutics, going to a vaccine here for the future, and what the president rolled out last week with Operation Warp Speed. Operation Warp Speed will be led by Dr. Salawi and Army General Perna to help provide the manufacturing and distribution of a vaccine with a goal of getting 300 million doses by the 1st of January. So huge efforts by the Department of Defense. Your airmen are involved in every part of that. And as I go visit the airmen, what I've come away with is this unleashing of this incredibly innovative airmen that are empowered. We're trying to get we use this as an opportunity, the chief says, of all those things that have been holding us back, has it been bureaucracy? What would we do differently? And how do we change the paradigm to this has been a challenge that we turn into an opportunity to reset the force and to do things that we'll never go back to. So here we are having a webinar. Who knew about Zoom? And today we're all Zooming or some form of that today around the country. Video teleconferences, meetings like this are the standard. We have the vast majority working from home. Some of that workforce may never come back to a crowded building in the future. It may be teleworking becomes we're working where we are, wherever that may be, and the technology allows us to be able to do that. But I think there's been some terrific work that's gone on with our airmen, whether it be General Miller and the AMC crew and what they've done with the great deal of support across not only the country, but the world, delivering supplies. Whether they've built this transportation isolation system to be able to move COVID positive patients from the AOR to the hospitals. They've just been, the team has been remarkable in what they're doing.
In reviewing investment priorities by the other services, there is a significant focus on long-range strike capabilities. And this comes at a time when the Air Force is investing in the standoff options. And while more capability is a positive, there also comes a point where it's important to assess the respective strengths, weaknesses, and business cases behind each option. Given that dollars are going to become increasingly tight, how do you see this comparative assessment occurring? First, do you believe that one's necessary across the Department of Defense? And second, do you think there's any possibility that it will be a candid and honest look at, hey, the Army's investing in a 1,000-mile gun, the Marine Corps want cruise missiles, meanwhile the Air Force is building the B-21 and has resident capability in the long-range strike arena. What are your thoughts on this subject?
Well, Dave, I think, again, as we look across the department and, what's the theory of victory? What's the joint warfighting concept? How do each of the services contribute to that? I think that as the budgets get tighter, certainly we're going to have to minimize any overlap and redundancies on those. And then we're going to have to be able to show the strengths of each of the different services and where they contribute. For us, when you look at some of the capabilities we've developed, we have the platforms to do long-range strike in terms of whether it be a B-52 or B-1, B-2, B-21 moving forward in terms of platforms. We've invested in the C2 to be able to support it. We've got we're in development of the weapons that can support that at varying distances and various speeds. So again, we're going to have to have that discussion. How does it get there? How do we protect it? How do we sustain it? How do we see to it? We think we have a pretty strong story to tell about the capabilities that we've built as a force. It provides the nation capability. It provides the Secretary of Defense and the President options across the globe.
Okay, well, General Wilson, I want to save some time for our media representatives as well as the other folks in the audience. Several of our Air Force civic leaders are in attendance today, and And so before we wrap up this session, I'd really like to thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedule. And on behalf of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies and all of Air Force Association, we wish you all the best.